The boys are back in town.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Wednesday and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Randy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Folks, take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONCollege at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. The transfer portal is officially closed. It closed on Tuesday night. There are probably going to be some stragglers as the paperwork gets finalized, but the good news for Gonzaga is they confirmed a few hours before the portal closed, Braden Huff and Graham Ike both returning for Mark Few's club. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the surprising and confusing news that Ben Gregg has entered the transfer portal despite being out of college basketball eligibility. We'll break that down. We'll talk about Gonzaga's current lineup and rotation projected for next season now that the portal window to enter has closed. And then we'll close out the show talking about what they need, what they might pursue in the transfer portal. And we'll talk about a new Zag on the women's basketball team here on this live edition. We'll be going live at 3 p.m. Pacific time all week long. We're going to do so again on Thursday. It'll be a little closer to 3:30 on Thursday, and then we'll do another live show on Friday as well. If folks are liking this, let me know. We may continue to do these live shows throughout the offseason as well. But we're going to start with the big news that came out a couple hours before the transfer portal deadline, confirmed by Gonzaga on their social media accounts. Both Graham Ike and Braden Huff are returning for the Zags. They are not putting their name in the transfer portal. They are not leaving to pursue professional basketball opportunities. And there have been kind of rumors about both. I will start with Braden Huff. Pretty much as soon as the transfer portal window opened 30 days ago, it was rumored that Braden Huff was going to enter the portal. Wisconsin was a big school, that their fan base, their people over there were talking all sorts of craziness that Braden Huff it's confirmed, it's a done deal. He's leaving Gonzaga, he's coming to Wisconsin. And I never once gave any of those rumors or discussion any conversation here on the podcast because that's all they were. There was no confirmation from anybody that had any real sources that this was something that was going to happen. Obviously, at this point, it is now clear that it was not something that is going to happen. It doesn't mean that there wasn't real conversation. It doesn't mean that this may not have come from nowhere. It's possible that Braden Huff did have negotiations or conversations with Wisconsin or some other school and was going back and forth with Gonzaga about, the pay and everything like that. All that could have happened. In fact, probably did happen. But at the end of the day, unless you hear something from a player directly or a very, very credible reporter, it's just noise. And that ends up being the case here with Braden Huff. I would not have wanted to be stressing for the last 30 days about whether Braden Huff's going to return or not. I know that's just part of the deal in the transfer portal era, but here we are. Braden Huff confirming on social media he's back. He's going to be back in that mix. Graham Ike as well. I never really felt like Graham was going to transfer. Like that would have very much caught me off guard. It was never really seemed like a conversation for him, but I was more concerned about whether Graham would want to return to college basketball. And for those of you who are everyday listeners, longtime listeners, you probably know that a lot of the stance that I had during the regular season was the expectation that Graham Ike would not return for next season. I was wrong about that, and I have almost probably never been happier to fully admit to being wrong about a projection or a prediction going forward. I thought Graham Ike would be done playing college basketball, that he felt like he'd done all that he can do, et cetera, et cetera. Should have calculated the fact that you can make millions and millions of dollars playing college basketball. And for a player like Graham Ike, who's not going to be an NBA player, I would rather be in college and doing that as opposed to trying to make my way professionally, which he'll do after this year. He'll move on to that stage of his life. But for now, why not stick it out? Why not keep playing in a place where you have the capability of becoming an All-American, where you're the best player on one of the best teams in the country, coached by a coach who is phenomenal at getting the best out of big men, who has this incredibly high usage rate. I mean, there's not a better place to be. as a starting center low post scorer than with the Gonzaga Bulldogs. So I don't blame either of these players for being back in the mix. So what does it mean for Gonzaga? Well, it means the starting front court set for the 2025-26 season. Graham Ike and Braden Huff are going to start at the center and power forward positions every single game that they're healthy next year. That you can book that and you can write that in Sharpie. Like, that is happening next year. They started just 3 times together this past year, as Ben Gregg and Michael Ajayi did this starting at the power forward position for the majority of the year. But at the end of the season, they made a starting lineup change, which I speculated at the time was not just to counteract the size of St. Mary's or just to kind of try something different going into the NCAA tournament. But I thought maybe this is kind of trying to sell these two guys on, hey, you can both come back next year and we'll make it work. We'll play both of you. We'll give you both big minutes. If that was part of the calculation, it was a very shrewd move by the coaching staff because it helped land both these guys back in Spokane for next year. But it also worked against St. Mary's in the WCC championship, a team that they did not beat in the regular season. Braden Huff and Graham Ike combined to score 29 of Gonzaga's 58 points in a messy, ugly, but ultimately victorious game against the Gales to give Gonzaga a automatic berth in the NCAA tournament, where they then started together again against Georgia in the first round, scored 31 of Gonzaga's 89 points in a blowout win over the Bulldogs, and then scored 38 of Gonzaga's 76 points in what ultimately ended up being a very narrow loss to the Houston Cougars. Now, Gonzaga doesn't really have a power forward on the roster. Last year's team had 3 players that I would consider power forwards on the roster. That would be Ben Gregg, who is out of eligibility. We'll talk about him in a second. That would be Michael Ajayi, who transferred to Butler. That would be Junsuk Yo, who also entered the transfer portal and posted on social media recently that he will announce his next move coming soon. So for Gonzaga, they have Braden Huff and Graham Ike, who I consider them both 5s, but obviously next year Huff will be a 4, so it doesn't really matter what I consider him. He's going to play power forward. And then Ismaila Diani being the backup 5 and kind of the backup forward in general. We'll talk more about the depth chart and kind of where it's at right now and what Gonzaga needs to do in a follow-up segment. But for right now, I think it's pretty clear that Gonzaga's 2 starters in the front court are going to be Huff and Ike. Another thing I'd mention here before we get to the Ben Gregg side of this conversation, the fact that these 2 guys are coming back probably has a lot to do with the fact that Gonzaga hasn't also landed a transfer. Let me say it this way. These 2 things are related. Gonzaga not having landed anybody in the transfer portal and Graham Ike and Braden Huff both still being at Gonzaga are related things, because Gonzaga will always prioritize retaining talent over acquiring new talent. Not every team does that. Many teams recruit over players currently on the roster. The amount of times that we have seen a team land a player in the transfer portal and a day later, a player from that same team at that same position enters the transfer portal. I mean, this is happening on a literal daily basis in the modern era of college basketball. That's not to say it's never happened at Gonzaga. The timing of landing Malachi Smith and Hunter Salas entering the transfer portal comes to mind. There are other examples that have come to mind as well, but that's a very obvious one that stands out right now. But Gonzaga's a school, they don't have the $20 million that some of these other programs do. They're the $10 million. I don't know their exact NIL budget. I think it's bigger than a lot of fans think that it is, but they're not in the A tier or the S tier of budgets in college basketball. But I cannot imagine that they were able to retain Graham Ike and Braden Huff for anything less than, honestly, probably like $4 million. Like, there's no way that, and that's a complete guess. I do not use this as reporting. It is a guess on my part. But there's just no way that, like, those 2 guys could go command millions from other programs with the level of success that they've had. For Gonzaga to keep them, they had to pony up big money. That doesn't mean that they're completely broke and can't afford other players, but it means they prioritize keeping these 2 kids in-house in Spokane as opposed to spending that money somewhere else and just hoping that those guys will stay. That's my guess. That's my read on the situation. It seems like a fairly logical conclusion to come to based on the fact that Gonzaga has struggled to land players. They didn't spend $3 million on Rodney Rice, who went to USC. By the way, a guard at USC, Desmond Claude, entered the portal a day later, just like I said. They didn't spend whatever some other programs spent on Brendan Howson or what Baylor spent on Dan Skillings or anything like that, because they prioritized spending that money to keep their 2 players in the front court. And now they'll turn their attention to adding some guards, some other players like we'll talk about later in the show. I'm not going to give a ton of time to this Ben Gregg thing because, frankly, I just don't think it's particularly significant. Ben Gregg does not have any more college basketball eligibility. He entered the transfer portal as kind of a keep your options open type situation. He told Theo Lawson of the Spokesman Review, I'm doing this to give myself options if the NCAA grants an extra year of eligibility, but I'm primarily focused on pursuing my professional career. He is not alone in doing this. Ian Shefflin, Chase Hunter, Jaden Zachary from Clemson all entered the portal. None of them have eligibility left. A more familiar face for Gonzaga fans, Efton Reed has done the same thing, entering the transfer portal without eligibility left. There are tons. Julian Reese from Maryland. We talked on yesterday's show about Trent McLaughlin from Northern Arizona. These guys don't have eligibility, but they're hoping the NCAA will make a ruling that says everybody gets an extra year, everybody gets a fifth year, whatever it may be. There's no indication that's going to happen. But if you're Ben Gregg, we'll use him as the example, and you're pursuing a pro career and you're looking at, all your options, Gonzaga, adds some players to their roster. They add a power forward. They're all set up for next year. And then suddenly the NCAA says, hey, everybody can come back to school, and Gonzaga's roster is full or they don't have room for Ben. Now he has options to go make potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars playing college hoops somewhere else. I get why you would do it. I don't think it is particularly likely that there will be an extra eligibility granted for Gregg or Shefflin or any of these guys. I don't think it's something to really concern ourselves with. If the rules change, we'll have a much longer conversation about it at that time. But for right now, my assumption is that Ben Gregg will move on to his professional basketball career, and that assumption has not changed even in the slightest with this announcement that he is entering the transfer portal. It's just not something that I think is particularly, I think it's significant in the sense that it's confusing and weird, and obviously the NCAA needs to do something about the fact that players are just making announcements like this and that there seems to be chaos and fans are confused and frustrated and alienated and coaching staffs have no idea what to expect. There's some serious issues with this whole situation, but I don't blame Ben or any of these players for doing this because there's no harm in making this decision, and it potentially keeps your options open if the rule is changed. We just need the NCAA to actually do something and make some kind of ruling here and a hard and fast rule so that we can move on without all of this murkiness and confusion that's plaguing college basketball in the modern era. Well, folks, now that the window to enter the transfer portal is closed, we're going to talk about what Gonzaga's roster currently looks like. We're going to get into that, the rotation, the lineup, where they need to make some potential additions, all that coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, have you ever checked your bank account and wondered, where did all my money go? Between dining out, online shopping, and just general entertainment, it's pretty easy to lose track. And that's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app, it is a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place, so you stop just managing your money and you start building wealth. And instead of juggling multiple apps, you can use Monarch to check your finances, track spending, and even plan your long-term goals. My wife and I always want to make sure we are on the same page when it comes to our finances, especially now with a 1-year-old. As it turns out, they're pretty spendy. And thankfully with Monarch Money, managing your money with your partner is smoother than ever. You can track your shared and personal accounts, set your goals, and stay on the same page without all the added stress. So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONCollege at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONCollege for half off your first year. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and we're still talking about the close of the transfer portal window. That is the 30-day window where players were allowed to enter the transfer portal. That is, of course, does not mean that players have to have committed by then. Otherwise, there'd be about 2,400 players out there who are not signed to current college basketball rosters. So there's still plenty of news, plenty of stuff going on this offseason. But the players currently on Gonzaga's roster are now no longer eligible to enter the transfer portal. And that is the case for every team in college basketball, except in the case where teams have coaching changes, which for the most part, I don't think there will be very many more of them in the coming months. But when that happens, we will have a potential for more players to enter the portal. But for right now, we're done. It's done and dusted. We are out of the transfer portal entrance era of this season of college basketball. So let's take a look at what that means for Gonzaga's roster. We now know, of course, that Braden, Huff, and Graham Ike are returning, and they are 2 of 8 scholarship players who are on Gonzaga's roster currently for the 2025-26 season. As a reminder, amongst the millions of rule changes there have seemingly been in college basketball in the last half decade or so, the scholarship limit is changing as well. And part of this is part of the House settlement that has not been finalized yet. So there's still some confusion on it right now, but the expectation is that teams will have 15 scholarship spots for the upcoming season. Gonzaga has filled slightly more than half of them, with 8 scholarship spots taken and 7 still to go. I don't necessarily expect Gonzaga to fill all 7 of those spots with new scholarship players. There's the possibility that they will keep a few open. There's the possibility that they will give some of their walk-ons scholarship spots. There's a lot of different things that could happen. But right now, the players on scholarship for the Gonzaga Bulldogs in the 2025-26 season, Graham Ike and Braden Huff, we know that. We've already talked about them, as well as the 2 red shirts from last year, Jalen Warley, who transferred from Virginia after spending 3 years at Florida State, and then Braden Smith, Colgate guard, who transferred early in the offseason but spent the entire year redshirting. Warley didn't join the team until kind of the middle of the year, but both those guys are on scholarship and ready to roll for next year. And then 2 other returners who played last year in small roles. That would be Tarleton State transfer Emmanuel Innocente, and then center Ismaila Diani from Spain, who was a freshman last year. So that gives you 6. Your other 2 are Steele Venters, who of course has spent the last 2 years, unfortunately, on the sideline with a knee injury followed by a foot injury, both which were season-ending injuries for the Eastern Washington transfer. And then incoming freshman Davis Fogel, the only member so far of Gonzaga's 2025 recruiting class, who was recently named the 32nd best player in the 2025 class per ESPN's updated rankings, a player who was not in the top 100, who snuck into the top 100, I think, like last year, and then was kind of floating around the 60s, 70s by most media outlets now after a strong season at Compass Prep and strong performances in the summer circuit last year. He is now a top 35 prospect in the 2025 class. So those are your 8 scholarship players. Gonzaga also has 3 walk-ons on the roster as of now. That would be Cade Orness, that would be Noah Holland, and that would be Joaquin Arreyes Moore. Q played last year after redshirting his first year. Both Orness and Holland redshirted last year. Holland, a junior college transfer whose parents went to Gonzaga. Orness played high school basketball in Kitsap, actually played against Davis Fogel in high school. Was a very, very good high school player. Both those guys redshirted last year. So that's the roster situation. 11 players, 8 on scholarship, 3 who are walk-ons. Again, it's possible some combination of these 3 players gets added onto a scholarship. I would guess it would be Q before anybody else because he's been here a little bit longer. Maybe Halan just because he's a junior college guy, but they also could leave those scholarship spots potentially open. So that's the 11 players on Gonzaga's roster. The 4 who left via the transfer portal would be Graydon Lemke, who was a walk-on last year, Junsuk Yo, and then Mike Lajayi, who went to Butler, and Dusty Stromer, who went to Grand Canyon. So here's your roster situation right now. Take a look at the projected starting lineup, projected depth, projected rotation, and then we'll close out the show talking about kind of what's next, what Gonzaga needs to do to add to the roster. I expect 4 of Gonzaga's 5 starting spots are fairly well established at this point. I won't spend any more time talking about the front court. It's Graham Ike and Braden Huff. We spent the whole first segment on that. We will move on. The backcourt is where it's a bit more murky at this point on the roster. However, I expect the 2 players who redshirted last year, who have been in the system for, in Smith's case, a full year, in Warley's case, half of a year, who are very experienced, very talented players. I expect right now the expectation is both of them will be in the starting lineup when the season begins in early November. So that would be Ike and Huff in the front court, Jalen Warley starting at the 3 or starting on the wing, and then Braden Smith replacing Ryan Nembhard at the point guard position. That was always kind of the plan with Braden Smith, who was the Patriot League Player of the Year while at Colgate, who averaged 12.5 points and 5.5 assists per game last year. Jalen Warley is more of a point forward. He's a facilitator. He's not much of a scorer, only averaged 7.5 points per game as a junior at Florida State. But he's a very long, very rangy, very athletic defensive player and a good offensive player, just not particularly much of a scorer. That's the 4 starting spots that I think are fairly well established. The shooting guard position is where there's a bit of a question mark. And really the crux of the question for that position right now is the health of Steele Venters, a kid who missed 2 full years Again, he had the knee injury 2 days before Gonzaga's season started, not last year, but the previous year, which thrust then freshman Dusty Stromer into the starting lineup. He recovered from the knee injury, was getting back to full speed, working out, and then suffered a foot injury, or an Achilles injury, I think that it was, and had to miss a second consecutive season. If Steele Venters is fully 100% healthy, and to me, that is a big if, while we wait for any kind of update on the young man, then I think he does start at the 2. Because what I think Gonzaga needs to fill out this roster and rotation is a bigger guard who can space the floor and shoot from the outside, because they don't have a lot of shooting on this roster, and the size limitations in the backcourt were a big problem last year. Venters is 6'7". He averaged 15 points per game at Eastern Washington in his last healthy season, and he is a knockdown three-point shooter. He doesn't do a ton else, not a great passer, not a great defender, but he is a 6'7" guard who can shoot the three. If he is fully healthy and is that version of Steele Venters, the kid we saw at Eastern, you throw him into the starting lineup, you're good to go. You got a good facilitating guard in Braden Smith. You got a great shooter in Venters. You got a great rangy, versatile defensive player who can move the ball in Jalen Warley. You got 2 great low post scorers in EK and Huff. You're good. You got your starting 5. Your depth beyond that, Ismaila Diane is going to step into a bigger role after a promising freshman year that also included some injuries that had some really big moments for the young man. You're going to have Emmanuel Innocente. The only reason I wouldn't put him in the starting lineup is I think he's too similar to Jalen Warley. They're both 6'5", 6'6". I think Warley's 6'7", but they're both bigger wings who are very good defensive players, very good on-ball defenders, but don't provide much offensively. I think it's great to have 2 players like that on the roster. I don't think it's great to have both those guys starting. I think it limits your team's offensive capabilities. So I would expect that Innocente does not start as long as Warley starts, but I think he'll play a bigger role this year than he did last year, to look more like what he did in the second half of last year when he kind of carved his way into a regular rotation spot. And then 8th right now is Davis Fogel. If the season started right now and Zags didn't make any additions, that's what I expect the lineup to look like. The depth is obviously a concern. We're going to talk about that to close out the show, but Fogel right now, I think, is probably, again, if the season started now, he'd be in the rotation. I don't know that that's what Gonzaga wants necessarily. He's a good freshman. I don't think it would be the end of the world if he was playing minutes for this team right away. But my expectation is that the plan is to bring him along a little bit more slowly than that. And that's why I expect that this roster, again, with 7 open scholarships, is not done being made. And we're going to talk about that to close out the show, because we've been talking about specific player portal additions all offseason. But right now, I want to just take a more general look at what types of players Gonzaga might add to this roster between now and the first game in November. We have that conversation coming up here in just a second. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, still talking Gonzaga roster, lineup, rotation, projected additions, all of that here as we are doing our first episode at the conclusion of the transfer portal window, the window to enter the transfer portal. So now we know that the players who are on Gonzaga's roster, they're locked in, baby. They are not going anywhere between now and the start of the season. So we just talked about what Gonzaga's lineup and rotation looks like at the current moment with Graham Ike, Braden Huff, Jalen Warley, Steele Venters, and Braden Smith. Our projected starting 5, assuming health for Venters, and then Ismaila Diane, Emmanuel Innocente, and Davis Fogel as your 3 depth options at the current moment. So what does Gonzaga have room for? What are the potential additions that they could make? I think the most obvious one, and it's obvious in terms of looking at the roster as well as looking at the players that have been connected to Gonzaga that we know the Zags have reached out to, that we know that they've contacted, had Zoom calls with, tried to bring on campus. The Zags are looking for a shooting guard. They haven't really been super active in contacting bigs. They haven't been active in contacting point guards really outside of Donovan Dent, who, if you can get Donovan Dent, you got to get Donovan Dent. There's no reason to not contact him. But for the most part, a list, which I have here on my second monitor, of the players Gonzaga has contacted in the transfer portal, pretty much all of them are 6'4" to 6'7". They're guards or wings. Most of them are good three-point shooters. Like, it is very consistent what the staff is trying to do out of the transfer portal. And again, I don't think that this says anything about Steele Venters' specific status. Like, I wouldn't read the Zags pursuing Rodney Rice or Adam Miller or Jaden Glover or Jordan Ross or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, as being, oh, this must mean Steele Venters isn't healthy, or this must mean. It just means that it's an area they don't have depth. It's an area they need more at. Yes, I think that there's, even in the most positive outlook of Steele Venters right now, you have to be concerned that he's not going to be able to play at the very least at full strength, if not at all, just because of the severity of back-to-back season-ending injuries. He has, I mean, the best case scenario, even if he recovers fully and is able to go, he still won't have played in college basketball game action in 2 years. That's really difficult to get back to that level of play coming off of those injuries. So for Gonzaga, that's an area of need. And realistically, a player they add in that spot could be somebody who's capable of being this team's like second or third leading scorer. Because right now the offense is a little too reliant on EK and Huff. You need more guard scoring. Last year's team had Caleb Battle, who was a bit inconsistent, but was absolutely a player capable of leading that team and scoring every single night. They had Nolan Hickman, who was also a bit more inconsistent in the sense that he would kind of disappear in certain games, but he was a knockdown three-point shooter who could go get you 15 or 20 in a given night. And then they had Ryan Nembhard, who was never much of a scorer, but was the straw that stirred the drink in an incredible way. This team's current backcourt does not have a go-to scoring option. It's not Jalen Warley. He's never been that guy. It's not Emmanuel Innocente. He's never been that guy. And it's not Braden Smith. He's a decent scorer, but he's not going to be a 15, 20 point per game, I'm going to go look for my shot type player at Gonzaga. That's not his game. It's not going to be his game. So that's not something that exists on Gonzaga's roster, but it is something that they are looking at. And we talked about a few of the names we know they've already contacted, even guys who have already committed in the transfer portal, like Trayson Eaglestaff or Brendan Housen or Dan Skilling. So we talked about Rodney Rice was a big-time guy that the Zags were trying to get. There's some others out there that we've talked about on the show that would have made sense. Some who've already committed to other places or don't seem to be considering Gonzaga. Tanner Toolson from Utah Valley, Trent McLaughlin, who we're not sure if he's got eligibility from NAU, but he'd be a great addition. Dylan Darling from Idaho State would be one. Lamar Washington from Pacific. He's a bit more of a point guard, but you could play him off ball if you needed to. One player that we talked about a little bit that sounds like he's going to Illinois, unfortunately, is Andrei Stojakovic, but my goodness, would he be a phenomenal addition for the Zags at that shooting guard position. So I think that's the biggest need. That's the biggest area that I expect Gonzaga to continue to really try to find in the transfer portal, whether it's a player they've already contacted, like an Adam Miller or a Jaden Glover, or even Jordan Ross from St. Mary's. We'll talk about him later this week, or somebody who they haven't contacted yet. They haven't really made a move for. We'll see what that looks like, but I expect that to be kind of the biggest area where Gonzaga is going to make a move. But I also think we're going to see at least one player added to the front court, and it's probably going to be somebody who's more of a 4 than a 5. Because like I said, Graham Ike is a 5, Ismaila Diani is a 5, Braden Huff, outside of 3 games, has pretty much exclusively played the 5 at Gonzaga, and that's it for the front court. So they need more. Typically, they have 4 or 5 front court players. They typically only have 3, maybe 4 in the rotation. Last year, they definitely had 4 in the rotation, which was a bit unusual for the Zags, but right now they only have 3 on the roster. So there's going to be at least one addition in the front court. I expect it to be a power forward, and I expect it to not be somebody who is going to come in and immediately play big minutes, because I don't think the Zags are going to be able to promise big minutes because they're starting the 2 bigs going into next season. So it'll be somebody who's more of a depth option. Maybe if they can pull it off, a younger guy who could develop like an Ismaila Diani type, if they can find it. It's hard to find players like that necessarily. Young players who have a lot of eligibility tend to be very valuable on the open market, so that's a bit of a tough sell. But I expect that Gonzaga will look for a backup power forward type. Jacob Dar from Rice is a name that they've contacted. He's kind of a 3, but maybe could play some small ball 4. I am curious if the Zags will attempt to play Warley at the small ball 4. He's, like I said, he's 6'7". He's always kind of been labeled a guard. He's kind of a point forward type, but with his size and range, I think he could be a power forward, particularly in the WCC. My guess is that's more of a in case of emergency break glass type situation, not something the Zags want to plan on doing going into the season. And then I think you'll expect to see some young depth. Backup point guard would be great. right now, unless they think Davis Fogel can play the one, which he kind of did in high school at Anacortes, but I'm not sure that he's a pure point guard. But maybe that's what the Zags want him to be. If that's the case, maybe he's your backup one to start the season. Like I said, Warley could kind of play the point forward position, but whatever guard they do add in the portal, I wouldn't be surprised if it's somebody who can also handle the ball in a pinch, because Braden Smith's not going to play 40 minutes every single game. So those are kind of I wouldn't be surprised to see 3 additions: a starting 2-guard caliber player, a backup power forward caliber player, and then a backup point guard type. There might be more additions, but I think those are kind of the 3 that I would expect to see. And it could be some combination of transfers, could be international players. Gonzaga's been connected to some international names already. They've added international players every offseason for the last couple of years. Diani last year, Luka Krajinovic, Pavle Stosic the year before that, Junsuk Yo before that. All guys who haven't had huge roles at Gonzaga. Diani, I think, the highest upside out of that group, but I wouldn't be surprised to see Gonzaga continue to look in that kind of space for a couple more additions this offseason as well. Well, folks, quickly here before we get you out and on with your day, the Lady Zags landed another player in the transfer portal, Zaria Akuso from St. Mary's. Second year in a row, the Zags have added a starting guard from the Gales to come over to Spokane. Last year was Taylor Dalton. This year it is Akuso, 5'10" guard from Amarillo, Texas. 2 years at St. Mary's, 2 years of eligibility remaining. She was a 2-year starter for the Gales last year, averaged 9 points, 3.5 assists, shot 35.5% from 3. The Zags need it. They need some depth in the backcourt. They already lost Esther Little and Taylor Dalton, who are out of eligibility. They lost Claire O'Connor to Colorado and Bree Stallenbien to Ball State in the transfer portal. Returning is Allie Turner, who led the team in three-point shooting last year, Inez Betancourt, and then 2 seldom-used backup guards, Cristabel Osorobo and Vera Gunadin. They added Taryn Gardner from Boise State. Now they add Akuso from St. Mary's, some more critical depth and starting caliber players coming to Lisa Fortier's team as they look to reload after losing a huge chunk of talent from last year's roster. It's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Folks, thank you so much for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. I'll be back live with y'all on Thursday, probably about 3:30 Pacific time, with another show talking transfer portal, talking some player in review episodes as well, all coming your way here soon. Thanks again for listening, folks. Have a fantastic rest of your day. And as always, go Zags.